our second brainstorming session. Tomorrow actually is the International Day of Monuments and Sites, and this is a special time that the whole of ICOMOS and the whole of the heritage world actually thinks about the heritage for a particular topic. Right. The brainstorming session today has a certain focus, and I will describe more a little bit later. We have a logo here of the International Day of Monuments and Sites, but what you don't see here is that it is in a native language, in Filipino, in my native tongue. So this International Day of Monuments and Sites, as a background, is derived from this idea of complex pasts and diverse futures. As you've seen last year, there's this great issue of the Black Lives Matter, and there's a lot of things that have happened on the toppling of monuments in several places in the US and in Europe. And it calls upon a greater recognition of inclusion and diversity. The picture that we see here on the right is taken at Lafayette Park. And this is Andrew Jackson. People were trying to pull the monument down because of his treatment of Native Americans. There's a lot of considerations on or like issues that have come out after that, and as a lot of people in Europe also know that this has happened in that area as well. Now,
is this the White House? No. Huh?
Yes. If you see that is in front of it.
Oh, yeah.
So, but and then Trump came out and said that this is like this is about wiping out our history, wiping out the Confederate history. But the question is, what type of history is it, right? So there's a meeting that ICOMOS Germany provided with ICOMOS, and I was part of the moderators there as well, in July of 2020, which called for diversifying or decolonizing heritage, and identifying potentials of having conversations on racialized issues in heritage. And that led to further discussions after on a lot of different fronts on inclusive heritage practices. Of course, in ICOMOS, we also have the rights-based approach, which is another working group is dealing with that. And it led to, at the end of the year, a suggestion from US ICOMOS to think about these diverse futures. What does it really mean, right? So one thing to point out as well, as heritage practitioners, we are those people who are responsible for valorizing particular types of heritage. In selecting one type of heritage, there is a possibility of excluding certain types of heritage. So the responsibility is on us to provide more openness to different types of practices and heritage places. Now, these things don't only happen in the urban setting. Rural settings also have issues of non-inclusion of people and indigenous people and communities, and different types of heritage practices. So I do hope that we start looking into that and really think about our heritage practice. So this one I've mentioned in our first brainstorming session. The brainstorming session is about listening to various perspectives and integrating heritage in sustainable development. It is a means of creating a shared base of knowledge to level off ideas. Anyone can be discussing here. We're in a private platform that we think about these issues and see how we navigate a lot of different perhaps sometimes conflicting issues in the heritage practice. This is a time to also test out ideas and improve our ways of working, learn and share and co-create knowledge, and provide an informal space to think and share views. This year, this second brainstorming session is about inclusivity, gender equality, and indigenous people. We have two guest discussants today, which will be discussing empowering women and marginalized entrepreneurs in the heritage practice. Larry Coben, who was with us for our webinar series before, would also be sharing his ideas. He had a video recording he just sent today. And Edson Gabalfin from ICOMOS Philippines, who's from Tulane University, will be providing LGBTQ plus heritage sites for equity, diversity, and inclusion. This will be 15-minute conversations, and then there will be a 20-minute discussion afterwards, and then there will be an NC and ISC sharing after that. Yeah. So I'll end here for the moment. Larry has asked me to provide a video presentation, but he's here. He will be coming in. It's already 5 o'clock in the morning in where he is. But let me show you his video presentation, and we can have questions and discussions afterwards. Yeah. Hold on. Let me just share his video. Wait, I will have to share screen. Advanced sharing session. Okay, wait, let me just double. Excuse me for a bit. Yeah, hold on. Okay, good. So let me know if you will hear the video. Yeah. Oops, not this one. Where is the video? 1 second. Sorry, I clicked the wrong thing. Where's the video? Okay, share screen. Screen to perhaps share sound. Okay, let me know if you will hear it. Yeah. Oops, sorry. You're seeing my screen. Wait, where is my video? Okay, sorry. Technical difficulties. Okay, hold on. Share screen again. Share screen. Wait, I'm getting lost in my share screen. New share screen. There we go. Okay, got it. Can you see the video? Yeah.
Yes,
okay,
we can.
now...
Yeah, we can see the video.
Yes.
Okay, so I will have to play. Do you wait? Let's see if we hear the sound. I cannot see my... Oh, there you go. So play sound. Okay, there you go.
Good morning or evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'd like to thank Gabe Caballero for inviting me to give this talk, which, as you can see, is entitled Empowering Women and Marginalized Entrepreneurs in Heritage Practice, a subject which I think some of you know is very near and dear to my heart. But as we think about the SDGs are really designed to bring women and people who are marginalized in a variety of ways, and some of which I'm sure we'll hear about today, into a more equal place within society. And to do that, of course, we need to bring those people forward, not just in the world of policy, but in the world of heritage. And quite frankly, in these meetings, I'd like to hear more voices of those women and those who are marginalized at these kinds of conferences. And I hope to try to bring some of their voices to you here today. Now, in order to talk about women's entrepreneurship, really the focus is, of course, goal number 5 of the SDGs, which is gender equality. But given the importance of economic and educational equality to the achievement of this goal, obviously numerous other goals are directly implicated. You see a list here relating to poverty, relating to hunger and health. Goals 1, 2, and 3 are critical, but deeply, deeply, deeply tied to gender equality and economic development. Quality education, I hope demonstrate a little bit, and I have in prior talks, is critical as well to the achievement of this goal, as is decent work and economic growth. The result of that should be reduced inequalities in a more sustainable community for folks to live in. Now, I want to talk about 4 different ways that we need, things that I think heritage practitioners need to do in order to achieve the kind of results that I want to talk about, to bring women forward, to empower them, and they and these other marginalized entrepreneurs. Rule number 1, and I'll adjust each of these as I go forward, but the 4 of them are: first, listen to the women and the marginalized. tailor your objectives to meet theirs, and let them speak to the results. Too many of our programs have some abstract heritage result in mind, which is not what's desired or needed by the community which they're purporting to serve. Second, the broad diversity of goals that I just talked about should really prove beyond a reasonable doubt that we need to include lots of experts from other fields, defer to them, and often let them lead. Related to that, if we want to have policy influence, if we want to persuade people, if we want to not always be the group that gets the smallest amount of the budget and the remains and the scraps of what is left of the SDG table, we need to speak the language of others and persuade them using their own language. And lastly, and critically important, I think we need to use far more data, particularly quantitative data. So let's go to number one of those points, listening to the women. Every program should begin with asking what they need is what is important to them. Now, I have worked in several poor communities in 4 continents. And rarely, if ever, when I ask that question of anyone living in a community, is heritage something is the number one answer. And it's rarely even in the top 3 answers. Number 1 is usually jobs. Number 2 is either electricity or water. And number 3 is the other one of those. These are the kinds of things that are critical to communities and quite frankly necessary before they can bring the kind of focus on heritage that we would like to see from them. We need to design programs that meet these needs and objectives. And if your own objectives are different than those of the community you're serving, which they normally are, you need to figure out how to achieve them while at the same time prioritizing the goals of the community. If you want to achieve the SDGs, if you simply want to achieve your heritage goals, it's not necessary, but then stop please talking about purporting to meet heritage goals without ever SDG goals without ever actually doing it. You need to have measurable goals to see if these objectives are met. And you also need to actually have a budget so that you know what it costs to achieve them. You then need to go back to people and ask if the program has met their objectives, not just with quantitative, but with qualitative data. And not just when you finish the program, which is usually a wonderful halo followed by a party, followed by great happiness, but a year later and even 3 years later. So I suspect sometimes you would find a very, very different result. And finally, you have to let these participants be the advocates for the program. When you have a successful program, as I'm going to do in a moment here, let them speak about what the results are. Let them speak about what they learned and let them speak about why it's important rather than doing that yourself. So I wanted you to hear from one of the entrepreneurs. She'll introduce herself, who was a successful graduate of the program that we put together around the site, heritage site of Pachacamac, a miniature business school. You'll hear the words Escala, that is the business school, and you see it in my virtual background. I go everywhere with it. And let's see what was important to her from the program that greatly strengthened both the community and the heritage.
Hola, soy Marlene. Mi empresa se llama Muebles Educativos Chiquinova. Estamos muy contentos por las capacitaciones que nos ha venido dando la escuela Escala. Gracias a la señorita Alejandra, la señorita Cintia. Ahora estamos tratando de llevar a cabo todo el aprendizaje que nos han dado, como cómo gestionar una empresa. Nos han enseñado a cómo ser un buen empresario. Hemos también conocido el mundo de las finanzas. Hemos perdido el miedo a los números, ¿no? Que muchos tenemos ese miedo a los números. He aprendido personalmente a diferenciar las finanzas personales con las finanzas de la empresa, que eso nos ha ayudado bastante, ¿no? A tener un calendario donde podemos también programar día a día todas nuestras tareas. Luego también lo que nos ha gustado personalmente a mí es aprender a hacer un elevador, el mensaje del elevador. Acá yo lo tengo como recuerdo, mi mensaje del elevador. Para tenerlo claro, tiene que ser sencillo y poder convencer a todos nuestros clientes. Gracias a todas estas capacitaciones, mi empresa ha podido crecer.
If you don't think that those are important and critical accomplishments to achieving goal 5 and the other goals I set forth before, then you don't understand what those goals are about. Heritage can do that for people. Now, you may be thinking, well, she didn't mention heritage once. And as I said, that's pretty typical. But let's hear from the head of the PastsComplex site, Dr. Denise Potsi-Escot, who I think many of you know, and who should be speaking at every one of these conferences that you have, because no one in my mind has done better community-based projects that actually have achieved SDG goals. And working with Denise, we created a cooperative there called CSON. And I just want you to hear from Denise talking about what the impact of that program is on her heritage site, the heritage site, and the community around it.
El Museo de Sitio, a través de SPI, les propuso una serie de capacitaciones, una serie de posibilidades de abrirse a lo que es el mundo actual hoy día. Está María con nosotros. Con María tenemos sueños comunes.
For now. As Denise will tell you in that video, and if you talk to her and have her speak, community relations have never been better. Looting has stopped, site invasions have stopped, and these kinds of programs have opened up a whole range of potential collaborations between the site and the communities, all of which have gone a long way toward achieving sustainable development goals in that region. Now, the second point that I made is the importance of including experts from other fields. Our board members, for example, are archaeologists, they're diplomats, they're business people, they're reporters, they're sustainability experts, entrepreneurs, documentary filmmakers, business school professors, a broad range of relevant skills. And our informal advisory board has even more diverse skills. Heritage is only one of the necessary and relevant skills, and probably not the most relevant to achieving most of the goals, other than perhaps 11.4 set forth in the Sustainable Development Goals. If you are not bringing all of this knowledge to bear, you have little opportunity of either creating, documenting, or persuading someone else that you have created a program that's worth duplicating and increasing the budget for and expanding and scaling throughout your country, throughout the world, in order to save heritage everywhere. Sorry. Speak the language of others. I put this tweet up a few times, and I don't want to do it to make fun of Andrew, but it's really the best example of when you don't understand or speak the language of the people to whom you are talking or trying to persuade, you have no chance of succeeding. We all know Andrew, Marcy, all of these climate heritage people, they work incredibly hard. But this is diplomatic language. It's a polite equivalent of you have nothing to say, why are you here? And I know a lot of people think I'm a harsh critic, so I actually went to friends at the Council of Foreign Relations, where I'm a member, and I said, just take a look at this tweet and interpret what that means to me diplomatically. And none of the responses were things that I would really want to repeat here, because it just said the people who came to the meeting failed dismally and didn't persuade anyone that they were even relevant to further discussions. Climate science, economic science speak an entirely different language. Many of us are anthropologists and we understand the importance of that. And yet when we go to speak to other policymakers, we speak heritage and we speak archaeology. And that's not a language that for the most part policymakers speak or are interested in speaking. And when you don't make the case, in this case to climate people, you get results like this, which make it impossible for people to understand, much less adopt what you're talking about. Everyone can agree with the platitude that culture is important to solutions. No one disagrees with that. But what does that mean? How do you implement it? What will be the result of that? Why will the project be better and how much better? These are the things that don't seem to enter very frequently into our practice. And most importantly, perhaps, use data, particularly quantitative data. Data is the voice of those we're trying to benefit, and it's the language of those who we must convince. To do projects without objectives, measures, data, and actual results leaves you little chance for the voices of the people who are trying to benefit to be heard, because we don't know, and we can't tell anyone else how we are helping them, how they're getting better, or what, for that matter, what isn't working for them, what they hate, what the failure is. There is no shame in a failed project so long as you don't repeat the failure over and over again, which I would argue is frequently what transpires in heritage practice. So at that CSON project that I just showed you, you can see the sales figures for the 24 people who are participants in that project. And we spent that project was a little bit over $50,000. I can't tell you how many times I look at heritage projects that can't tell me the results, the budget, or the number of participants. The recent policy guidance document, which would be wonderful for a long other chat, has a slew of case studies, and there's not a number that I saw in any of them. So I don't know how to evaluate. A case study is supposed to persuade someone, at least in other fields, that something is worth doing. Well, if you don't know the number of people participating, the budget, and the results, I don't know how anyone is supposed to evaluate that and say, I want to do more of these. This kind of quantitative data needs to be critical to any kind of project, and it needs to be something that's included in your budget, and you need to go back and do it again. Now, people in our school, we collect data on all of these metrics, and I won't read them to you. If you want the slide, Gabe can give it to you, or contact me, and I can get to you. But this is telling us that whether or not the business skills that we are trying to impart to folks are actually getting through to them. Because we all know that some people at least want to please, and they'll say, yes, I'm learning everything, it's great. And we use two methods. One is quizzes, and one is we ask them, are you doing a whole set of things like that? So let me present the kind of results, a few of the results from these metrics, because these are the kind of things that when we go and talk to funding sources, when we go and talk at conferences that don't involve heritage, really resonate powerfully with people. 100% of the participants say they improved the way they managed. 84% improved their business and personal finances. The third one seems like minutiae, but it's actually in the economic literature. The third and the fourth one are both critically important. 85% are calculating fixed costs as compared to 10% before, and more than 70% of the participants in our program manage their business and personal finances separately, whereas earlier none did. These are extraordinarily important metrics for business success. We also were able to work with people to adapt for COVID. We've always had resiliency in the program, but now it's emphasized. 77% of the students started using online sales platforms and accepting digital payments during the pandemic. I didn't show you the part of the video where Marlene, who was speaking earlier, talks about how her Facebook page has improved her sales. And I'm sorry, I seem to have forgotten to include the link to her store, but I'm happy to do that. 53% began offering delivery service to adapt to the local quarantine conditions. Textile workers adapted to mask making. Ceramicists started making soap dishes, and none of the businesses went under. They're all suffering, don't get me wrong, but none went under. This is the kind of data, this is the only way that I know to decide whether what we're doing is worthwhile. Because if the data is terrible, why spend the money on that? You'd be better off taking your budget and handing it to the community itself, because believe me, they will spend it better than you ever will. So in conclusion, let me just say that we took a heritage program and moved it into the mainstream of SDG goal achievement, and we demonstrated the resonance of culturally based solutions, by understanding the needs of other stakeholders, most importantly, the women and marginalized entrepreneurs that we're trying to help, but also those who make the policy and the budgets that are critical to scaling and helping more people. This year, we plan to include over 500 people in our programs in spite of COVID. We've moved all of our programs online because of COVID in order to help us scale, and we hope we'll do over 1,000 next year. By speaking the language and utilizing the metrics of sustainable development stakeholders, others were quickly able to understand the relevance and efficacy of our program. Bringing diverse skill sets to bear was critical to that success. And I have to say, in conclusion, the only way to really have a seat at the sustainable development table, which will endure to the benefit of women, poor communities, and heritage, is to follow some kind of methodology like this. Thank you all very much for your time.
Okay, so I think that was good. Larry's here to, let me stop share. Larry's here as well to provide some inputs for later, and I've seen some questions are there. And I do appreciate the kind of conversations that we're having here, because the perspective of heritage in the poor communities is really, really different from what you see in more affluent societies, right? The question of business skills is quite important, and how do we get people out of that economic dilemma before looking at heritage, before conservation needs to be addressed. I think what we can do is that have your questions, type out your questions, and then we do the discussions afterwards. And we go to Edson Gabalfin, who will be presenting first for us the LGBTQ heritage sites. Edson, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gabe, for having me. Greetings from New Orleans and Louisiana in the US. I'm the Associate Dean for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in the School of Architecture at Tulane University. And what I'll be presenting today is related to LGBTQ plus heritage sites as it relates to equity, diversity, and inclusion. So let me just quickly share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see you.
Great. Thank you so much. So as the theme of the International Day for Monuments and Sites, what I'll be talking about specifically and sort of the role that I'm thinking and what Gabe had also asked me to do is to become sort of like a provocateur or to instigate questions about the relationship of equity, diversity, and inclusion as it relates to similar to what Larry had been presenting related to marginalized communities. And so I'll be focusing specifically on LGBTQ plus heritage sites as it relates to sustainable development goals, and then as it also intersects with equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so my brief talk covers sort of these three large areas, and then I'll focus on the intersection of all three at the end, and to really pose questions and ideas that hopefully will instigate some more conversation for the group and for others in the future. So let me just start off by just quickly talking about what are LGBTQ plus heritage sites. And so when I talk about LGBTQ plus spaces and sites, I specifically talk about spaces and sites that are used, appropriated, experienced, and or occupied by the lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer plus community. And historically, the LGBTQ plus community has been historically marginalized and oppressed by different forms and of systems. Governments, organizations, and societies. And so if we look at then LGBTQ spaces, we can then also see these spaces not just as sort of a kind of neutral container or a neutral site, but rather it sort of embodies and expresses the struggles and resistances of the LGBTQ plus community against heterosexual, patriarchal, and oppressive norms and systems. And therefore, we can, when we extend then looking at LGBTQ spaces as becoming related to heritage sites and related to monuments and sites, we can think of these LGBTQ plus heritage sites as something that is important to the histories, lived experiences, and I think more importantly also the hopes and dreams of the LGBTQ plus community. And the reason why I also highlight not the histories, lived experiences, and as well as the hopes and dreams, because like we often think of the LGBTQ community as their stories, their histories, as something that is not either acknowledged or recognized, and therefore sometimes are hidden and or are not even included in any kind of history and discussion. So I'm just showing a couple of examples of what I mean by LGBTQ plus heritage sites, and by no means are this is an exhaustive list or a comprehensive inventory, but I would just like to highlight some of them to begin thinking about like how do we consider them, especially as they're related to the histories and lived experiences of the LGBTQ plus community. So, one of kind of like the most sort of iconic and celebrated monument is the Homo Monument in Amsterdam, which is considered the world's first public monument dedicated to the LGBTQ community, as it acknowledges and also then remembers the persecuted gay and lesbian members. This was, of course, opened in 1987 and has become sort of like a benchmark for succeeding monuments on and or LGBTQ plus sites. Much later, there's also the Memorial to Persecuted Homosexuals under Nazism, which opened in Berlin. And this is a monument that specifically acknowledges and also then memorializes the homosexuals and the LGBTQ community that were killed or persecuted by the Nazis during World War II. And this was opened in 2008. But there are also other sites similar to the monument in Berlin. But there are also sites across the world that talks about the violence against the LGBTQ community. This is in New Orleans, in Louisiana, where I am currently at. This was a lounge called the Upstairs Lounge in New Orleans that was burned in 1973. An arsonist started the gay bar, which then killed 32 people in this event. Before the Pulse Disco shooting in 2016, this event in New Orleans was in fact like one of the deadliest event that then killed LGBTQ members. So it's about some of these sites are about violence. There are also other sites that talk about and celebrate the achievements of the LGBTQ community. Of course, some of them are also related to violence. Still, the Stonewall Inn, the highly celebrated gay bar also in New York, was the site of the riots in 1969 that then led to the beginning of the gay rights movement. So it's a national landmark. It's designated as a national landmark by the National Park Service here in the U.S. In a similar fashion, in Puerto Rico, for example, the Edificio Comunidad de Orgullo Gay de Puerto Rico is also another sort of recognized landmark. This was the meeting hall for the first LGBTQ organization in Puerto Rico that was established in 1974. So it's another sort of important site to kind of acknowledge the history of the community. But there are also other sites across the world also that may not necessarily fit in those categories. similar to kind of the categories of maybe celebrated events or celebrated histories, but there are also some of them might be everyday occurrences. This is the Quezon Memorial Circle. This is a large roundabout in the center of Quezon City, the former capital city of the Philippines, and I've studied this area before, and I've written about how this large monument, but then there's also a public park around it, has become a site for encounters between gay men, similar to how Central Park in New York City has been used, for example, in the 1920s and the 1930s. Encounters, the same thing had happened here. So despite this being a monument for the former president, Manuel Quezon, it's being used in a different way by the LGBTQ community. And so that kind of like also then presents the type of events and histories and stories that may not necessarily register, but still are important components of that of the LGBTQ community. And so what then some of these sites and histories also then highlight is that often LGBTQ identities are often seen as the other, usually an outsider, and are often rendered invisible and are also then excluded. So their stories, their histories are excluded. Their stories are either not even acknowledged. And that's something that then the LGBTQ community is continually fighting and struggling to be recognized and to be acknowledged by every sort of facet in the community. But we also then kind of acknowledge and then realize that LGBTQ spaces, in fact, contribute significantly to the value, to the legacy, and the sense of place in our societies and world. And therefore, we need to kind of begin to reconsider what the role of these spaces as it acts and as it sort of participates in our experiences, in our cities, in our towns, and so on. So I'm kind of like shifting now to just talk a little bit about the SDGs to set up also specifically looking at gender equality and what if we include LGBTQ rights related to gender equality and really specifically, of course, to goal number 5, which aims to empower girls and women to achieve equal rights. One thing that then we kind of look at this goal number 5 is that then it primarily focuses on women and girls. And my argument then, and something to think about, is that then, is there a way for us to begin to think about goal number 5 and gender equality to really expand other types of genders, not just related to women and girls? And so the idea that then if we begin to expand our idea of equal rights, of gender, of equal gender rights, that it's also actually for everyone, then it's something that we begin to rethink about how then these rights would then look like, and what would then our heritage sites also eventually look like. So, but I also wanted to argue that equal rights for everyone is not necessarily a zero-sum game, as others argue, and also others sort of criticize some of these gay rights movements and the LGBTQ sort of movement. But I want to argue that providing rights to marginalized groups does not take away rights from other groups. Again, because it is not a zero-sum game. So then what does this mean when we talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion? As the theme of inclusiveness and diversity for the International Day for Monuments and Sites, I wanted to also then link the idea of equity, diversity, and inclusion related to these heritage sites. But let me just briefly kind of define what I mean by equity, diversity, and inclusion. By equity, I talk about the state or the quality or ideal of being just, impartial, and fair. When I talk about diversity, I talk about acknowledging the differences among social groups such as ethnic heritage, class, age, gender, sexuality, ability, religion, and nationality. And then when I talk about inclusion, I talk about inclusion as not only celebrating differences, but actually also accepting and embedding them. So these three ideas of equity, diversity, inclusion are all interconnected. They do not necessarily live by itself, but rather they are also sort of mutually informing each other. And so then if we take those ideas of equity, diversity, and inclusion, we can then begin to kind of think about then how can we achieve equity, diversity, inclusion in heritage practices. And again, to sort of to begin the conversation, when I say equity, diversity, and inclusion in heritage practice, we can mean how is it that then we acknowledge the differences and that then we allow all voices to be heard. So this is also very similar to what Larry had said earlier about allowing really the marginalized groups to be able to express their own voice and to be able to really express then their sort of participation and their stories, especially stories that we don't normally hear or that stories that we ignore or we exclude. So we not only acknowledge the differences, we acknowledge that there are different stories, but we also allow these voices to be heard and to be included. Another point related to equity, diversity, inclusion in heritage practice, and by this I mean also that we allow everyone to contribute to the creation and practice of intangible and tangible cultural heritage. So this also embodies the idea of co-creation, that it's not just a certain narrow group of people then defining what is cultural heritage, but rather allowing different members of society, allowing everyone to be able to then define and also create these intangible and tangible cultural heritage. So that's a sort of a broad, also sort of idea in relation to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And therefore, when we look at the SDGs as it relates to equity, diversity, and inclusion, then we can begin to argue that then maybe the SDG goal number 5 needs to be expanded, and therefore we need to maybe look at different and other members of the marginalized communities that may not have had that opportunity to be heard and to be included and to be asked to participate, to also then be included and then be asked to participate and co-create these heritage practices. And the overall goal, to kind of end my discussion and sort of like my provocation, is that then we're all aiming towards a future that is just, fair, diverse, inclusive, and sustainable for all. So I'm not necessarily providing very specific directions, and I think because my goal is to provide provocations and then maybe provide and allow us to think about more questions about as we look at heritage sites and heritage practices, we can begin to think about them. How can we make this achieve a more just, fair, diverse, inclusive, and sustainable future? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Edson. I think that is also a very, very good presentation. There is indeed that kind of conversation that is thinking about inclusion, but also there are some spaces or the LGBT community wants to be kept hidden, right? There is that kind of nuances that is, what do you want to share? As you pointed out, I mean, my question here, what are the stories to tell and what are the stories that are left to be hidden, right? I think we have, for me at least, there's a lot of thoughts in my mind, but I've seen a couple of questions come in. So if you want, everyone, this is now the time to discuss and brainstorm ideas. I can give the floor to those people who has asked questions, and then we can start off with that. So Larry, are you around?
Yeah. I am here.
Yeah, very good. So there was a question on qualitative and quantitative data. which is asked by Becke, right? Becke, do you want to ask your questions in terms of numbers? Is it only numbers that are important, or qualitative data are also quite important? Becke, do you want to elaborate?
Yeah, actually, I was just putting it as a comment when he was speaking because it seemed like he was limiting everything to data. If there are no numbers, there's no way we can evaluate. And I was saying, quant is just one way of evaluating things. Qualitative data is also very important in evaluating things. So that was just a comment. Yeah.
Larry, how do you, because what you've provided is more of the results, let's say, how many people have learned things, how many people have achieved things. For you, how do you use qualitative data in your practice?
Well, I started with the two videos, and I was sort of tempted to play nothing but because those are pieces of qualitative data, obviously. But I would say that in SDG world, presentations that are devoid of quantitative data rarely travel very far. So we could have a long debate about qualitative versus quantitative data. We utilize both, obviously. But if you want to go into SDG world, if you want to go into climate world, and you don't want to talk about tons of carbon being removed from the system, if you want to go into economic development world and can't talk about how many jobs you're going to create and what kinds of revenues you're going to generate, all the qualitative data in the world is not, I don't think, going to persuade policymakers. So I think you need to definitely use both. And I think Heritage World has a tendency, perhaps because of its roots in anthropology and ethnography and a whole slew of other historical reasons, to tend toward qualitative data. The other is quantitative data generally needs to be collected over extended periods of time. So as you saw in the CSUN case that I put up, we have data back to 1914, which means we have to spend time and money going back to collect it every year. So I think there are a lot of ways to tell stories and to evaluate things, but again, it depends on your audience and speaking the language of others.
Correct. There was another question on data, actually, which is from Brittany. So are these the numbers that you provided? Are they what has happened after COVID? And then is there any, what are means of making these projects more resilient? Brittany, do you want to elaborate on your question? Oh, is she still around? But I guess I can ask that question to Larry. Is there any new data that have been produced with COVID?
Some of the data that I put up on that last slide, I saw when her question came in and I was sort of laughing, but the next slide, of course, was the COVID slide that I discussed. Sales revenue and revenue numbers are down. And one of the things we've been discussing with some of the stakeholders in other places, because this is crossing a slew of industries, is what is normal data for the COVID era? Every tourism business in the world is down 70%, 88%, 95%. So it's hard, everyone's graphs are going to show a decline and hopefully rise back up as the world begins to reopen. So we certainly have collected that data. The sales data is probably down for the CSUN ladies, roughly 70%. And I think it's starting to climb a bit out of the trough as Pachacamac has reopened in the last couple of weeks. We did help make adaptations for online sales, delivery services, etc. And part of our curriculum has always been these kinds of adaptations. We may have been a bit more specific with suggestions given the nature of the crisis.
Any questions so far? Because I have some questions for Larry, but I want to ask some questions for Edson as well. Anyone who wants to ask any particular questions to Larry?
Can I ask one?
Yeah, sure, please. Yeah,
really for both speakers. One, both very fascinating. When you're talking about collecting data, how do you collect data when the issue is so sensitive and people feel repressed? I think that that's an issue that I constantly find, is that when people collect data, it's often easy to collect data rather than the actual getting to the root of the issue or actually dealing with that. How in your experiences have you approached it? Because I have a student who is covering both issues right now, and actually how do you collect data where it can be seen as quite a sensitive, either culturally or I suppose culturally or societal ways, a difficult data to collect or even respond to? It's maybe an open question there.
Edson and Larry? Yeah.
I mean, I would say that I think we've done it primarily by creating a sense of community and interaction among the people who've participated in the programs, explaining its importance and how by providing that data, they're enabling other people to be able to participate in the program going forward, both from the funding point of view, and we explain that rather explicitly, but also to enable other people similarly situated to participate. It doesn't mean that we get 100% participation from the data people, and we collect it in a variety of ways, some of which enable people to make, a lot of the data, for example, that I presented with respect to the percentage of people who are doing personal finance, that those people can remain anonymous if they choose to. So we try to collect data both anonymously and with names attached in a variety of different ways. It requires a commitment of time and resources that prioritizes data collection.
Edson, do you have some thought? I think this is for more sensitive places, for more sensitive people. How do you actually derive data?
Yes, I think that is definitely an important consideration, and I think similar to also what Larry had also said, a lot of the work that I've done before is that you have to gain the trust also of your participants in collecting data. You have to be very honest with them how you're going to use the data and how it's going to be disseminated. It should be upfront. You cannot sort of hide it from them. And then the other one is guaranteeing their privacy, especially for a lot of, let's say, with the LGBTQ plus community. Some of them might not want to be exposed, again, because of fear of being persecuted, fear of maybe losing their jobs, and others. That is something that then you have to then either, if let's say it's qualitative and you're able to, let's say, derive, let's say, some of the information and then kind of share that as direct quotes, you provide pseudonyms. So you kind of need to hide some of those identities. The idea is that then you give your participants the choice whether they want to be identified or not, and that then you allow them to protect, and it's your duty then as a researcher to then protect their identity. If it's a larger pool of information or data, you can aggregate the data, so therefore it's not necessarily identifying very specific ones. And then if you do need to identify specific participants, then you maybe hide their identities. But it's very particularly challenging also, especially if some of the participants do not want to reveal their identities. And you have to respect that. You have to also ensure their privacy.
Yeah, so thanks for that, because that's the exact issue that I'm dealing with now. We're trying to preserve a site of someone who was at the leading front of HIV awareness in the UK. And again, we are facing those kind of similar issues with the research. So thanks for that. That's really useful. And again, thanks to Larry as well. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll take some notes, and if you don't mind, I'll share those with my PhD student to hopefully thing. But it's fascinating talk from both of you. Thank you very much.
One thing that I want to comment for Edson and getting of data, I realized, I Googled before that there was a national survey in the UK which actually identifies the number of LGBT people in the UK. There was a survey, and I can send a link to everyone. But I thought that was, I don't know how the data was collected, because as you said, there will be potentials of people not declaring their status, and it's like a state of mind. It's not like you say you're a male and versus female, or you have to identify all the different layers of sexual identities that are attached to gender identity. So it will be quite interesting how they derive that kind of survey that was done.
Well, actually, interestingly, that in the UK is that, one of the big movements that we've had is also people not having to identify themselves. We have a new pseudonym that we automatically applied, like for students. Instead of Mr. or Mrs., they can have MX in front of their name. And people can choose not to be identified. And this is for not just, people think, it's for people of transgender, or I think people are one of the great movements now, particularly with the most recent undergraduates. I would say that's that generation of students is they don't want to be identified as one group. They want that because they see themselves as one community. And I think that's quite an interesting shift that we're seeing in that movement. And as well, people are saying, because you then can't discriminate against me on paper. And I think that was quite a shocking, I think, for a lot of people, that they chose to do that because they did not want to be discriminated against. And that was their driver. And I think that's what shocked people. And it does. And we collect that data as well, Gabriel, in our UK census, which has just finished. You can declare it on your census, which is, I think, we're one of the few countries that has always collected that data, which has made it, when I say always, most recently been collecting it at a national and mandatory level, which is quite unusual, I think.
I think, James, to relate to that, then I think what you also then maybe point that's also important is that then it's providing agency. It's giving the students, the community, whoever, the opportunity to identify themselves rather than being labeled by somebody else. I think that's the key difference, right? That it's giving the students that ability to be able to identify themselves, what they want to be called or what they want to be labeled as. And I think because that has been the struggle of the LGBTQ community for so long, is that then the oppression partly is coming from how society, other constructs sort of then determine that, okay, this is who you are, but identity is sort of like a personal issue, and that means then it's about like allowing themselves to be able to identify for themselves like what they want to be identified. And I think that's kind of like one of the key difference maybe that has been going on in the recent decade or so.
I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, the example I can think of is a group of students who all changed their first title as a group because one of their friends was subject to discrimination. So they all, as a community, as a group of individuals, said, no, if one of us is going to be discriminated, we're going to all group together, and they all changed their title to MX as a kind of almost a communal act of, as defiance is not the right word, as supportive action. And I think that was what was interesting. And I thought that was very strong in the sense of we've seen that movement because, they weren't what we would traditionally, or what we have, I suppose, diversity terms would have intended that title to be used for, but they've actually now using it as a community of support. And I think that's what's quite positive to see in that movement. And let's hope that we stay in that positive direction. Yeah.
One thing that I just want to comment for Edson's presentation is many of the sites that have been put out there are sites of violence or commemoration of violence, right? That the whole act of removal or like a persecution was the starting point of that kind of memorial, which I hope that it is not just the stories that are told for the gay community, right? The
Right.
LGBTQ plus community. What I thought that one of the good spaces was the Berlin one, which I remember it is situated right beside the Holocaust Memorial, which is just across it, and it somehow links that whole story of the Holocaust with millions and millions of people with a small commemoration of a certain type of people that. And it is the same story, but told in a very dedicated way. So I thought that was quite sensitively done, and quite a poignant way of creating a heritage site on a particular focus.
And I think, Gabe, on that note, also, talking about violence and persecution, I think like what I'm also maybe looking forward to maybe in the future is that we're not only just commemorating violence, that maybe there are some monuments, or that when we look at some of these heritage sites or heritage practices, that it's about the joys and the hopes and the dreams, right? Because then that you're allowing the communities, to be able to celebrate rather than just commemorate the persecution and the violence. And I understand that's like it's an important beginning point. But I think like we hopefully, and again, that's my hope also, right? That then the hopes and the dreams of the LGBTQ community can also be then acknowledged and be recognized, that they also have dreams and aspirations, right? As in any other marginalized group, right? That they also need to be celebrated and be allowed to dream and also to aspire.
Yeah. So that leads to that one thought that I had, which is in the future, perhaps studies of festivals, the Mardi Gras festival, Pride walks will be added on to this kind of intangible heritage of a city, to create those memorable places that are celebrations of vibrancy of the cities. Exactly. I know that we need to move forward, but I just have one question for Larry before we continue. Is with regards to the silos that you've highlighted, and the very, very narrow perspectives that a lot of colleagues of ours are maybe be trapped in. How do you think that heritage practitioners can be more relevant to the bigger issues that are faced by everyone?
I think we have a lot of natural allies. We just need to reach out to them. I think people need to put what they're working on in front of people from other disciplines and get their comments. It doesn't mean you have to accept them all, but if a climate person looks at it and says, no one in climate will read this because it doesn't have the following data, you should at least be able to take that into account. Similarly for economists, I mean, I've generally found that people are more than happy. Everyone loves heritage. People are happy to help with the projects, but if they don't get asked, it doesn't happen. So from my perspective, most people are affiliated with universities or some organization where they can at least put a little, what I call a kitchen cabinet together, a group of informal advisors, and say, hey, take a look at this and tell me what it would take for it to be persuasive in your community. I remember once the Neubauer colloquium had one of the economics and law professors come over and critique some of the heritage proposals, and I think it infuriated the heritage people, but the insight was quite extraordinary, and for those who took it, I think quite helpful. But I think it also requires an openness to being criticized and having to rethink the way practice has taken place over the years.
Indeed. And then I think what you said also about failures, our own failures will be the key to the future success, right? So never be afraid of declaring those. failures of research or failures of the case studies that